All right, Bryan Hayden, thank you so much for coming on my podcast.
Glad to be here.
Yes. As I'm digging further into the culinary world and the origins of different food, it always kind of helps to start at the beginning of it. And you, as an archaeologist that specializes in some of the early agriculture and how that affected early on civilization, I'm like super excited to have you come on. I was wondering if you could get us started with a little bit of what your background is, and also, I know that we're going to be talking a lot about beer. And so, did you get more interested and focused on beer?
Well, it's a long story, but to keep it short, I got really interested in feasting and in archaeological studies because it had been neglected for so long. People have always thought, well, feasts are just, non-essential kinds of events that, were not worth a lot of attention or study, and that the basic subsistence was always the main focus. And feasts always seemed to be frivolous, incidental events that people just did for amusement. But no, as I say, it's a long story of how I got involved in this train of thought. But the conclusion was that I came to, and what got me really interested in it, was that I thought feasts might be implicated in the origins of domestication of plants and animals. For instance, after I started looking into it a little bit more, I mean, people have always assumed that goats and sheep and cattle and pigs were all domesticated to eat on a daily basis like we do when we go to the supermarket. But when you look at traditional cultures, pre-industrial cultures, that is not the case. The animals that get raised are raised, and people have said this explicitly, like putting money in the bank. Basically, they use their surplus food to raise these animals, or they produce more food to raise them, and they're extremely valuable as a result. And as a result of that, they only get used in special events, like feasts. And so that's what got me really going. And that's a remarkably consistent observation across pretty much every culture that I've ever looked at, that domesticated animals are not eaten on a daily basis. They're not part of general subsistence. They are special event kinds of things, and they are used to create debts. One of the things that came out of my research on feasts was that they're not just for amusement, they're not just to get away from the humdrum of daily life. They are political ploys to create debts among people and create networks of reciprocal networks, where if you're given a feast, then you have to give a feast to the same people. And if you're given a pig or a goat or a sheep or anything like that uh, in a feast or for a feast, then you have to return that. And if you don't, it's a social rupture and you're an enemy for life.
Mm.
And so there are real major consequences of not participating in feasts or just trying to cut them off
Mhm.
without paying your debts. So it's a whole different dynamic, a totally different dynamic. And um, one of the things I found in studying feasts, and I ended up writing a whole book on the topic, was that in feasts there's a triumvirate of things that constantly reoccur in all feasts. A triumvirate of foods, basically, and that is you need meat, and you need bread or starches, and you need alcohol. So those three things constantly reoccur in traditional societies and feasts. As Paul Halstead said to me, he's a British archaeologist who's done a lot of ethnographic studies as well in Greece. And he said, you know, in Greece, you can have a feast without meat, but it's a really poor, poor feast. You know,
A vegan feast.
yeah, yeah. People, turn their nose up at you for that kind of a feast. But he said a feast without bread is totally inconceivable. It just, you can't do it. So, and I would say alcohol is in the same boat.
Yeah, you're gonna have fun. Well, so that's actually and you said it was a long story, and feel free to tell us as much of a story as you want.
There's
But
more.
what's kind of your I mean, I know that you're speaking like in terms across other like multiple civilizations, but you said you mostly work in like the Natufian civilization, correct? If you give us a little background on that.
Well, not mostly. I assisted in an excavation
Mhm,
at a couple of Natufian sites
mhm,
years and years and years ago. So I was always keen and interested on that. But the Near
mhm,
East is where domestication first took place, at least
mhm,
for the Western
mm,
kinds of foods that we have, the sheep and the goats and the wheat and the rye and things like and the barley, etc.
mm,
So it's a natural focus of interest.
mm.
Um, but no, the most of the work on feasts that I've done has been in Southeast Asia and in Thailand and Laos and Indonesia. So we've done a fair amount of work there, over 10 or 12 years or so. And it's been really insightful, and Polynesia as well. We've done some work there as well. So those are where the major feasting traditions exist today. That's why we went there. So I've got a little bit of familiarity with the Natufian, but I've always retained a strong interest in it, and I've written a number of things about feasting in the Natufian because there's a lot of indication that it was going on then.
So then, do you feel like feasting and festivals is something that um do you see very much of that in like hunter-gatherer societies, or that's something that like you really only see in like settlement, like early agrarian societies?
Right. Good question.
Mhm,
So for 2 million years, people existed as what I would refer to as generalized hunters and gatherers.
mhm,
And they're very mobile. They have no storage. Basically, they take everything that they have with them when they travel, so they don't have very much. And they have what I would say is communal meals, but nothing you would really call that has all the characteristics of contemporary feasts or later
mm,
feasts among agriculturalists. But then when you get up closer to about 10, maybe 20,000 years ago, you start getting a change, a big change in that kind of lifestyle. And people become more sedentary. They don't move around as much. They stay in the same place seasonally and go back to it every
mhm,
year. And they start storing food,
mhm,
big storage pits or big granaries. They start having larger settlements, hundreds,
mhm,
uh, generalized hunters and gatherers, maybe 50 people or
mhm,
a bit more. When you get into these more complex kind of hunters and gatherers, you get hundreds or even over 1,000 people in a settlement. And you start getting indications of wealth because you don't have that with generalized hunters and gatherers. And you
mm.
start getting evidence of feasting. Like it's a real complex that comes together, a real major shift. I think it's the most important shift in cultural evolution. It's not agriculture. I think it's the shift into um, complex hunting and gathering societies where there's wealth, there are social and economic inequalities. Some of them have slaves. They start building big structures like on the northwest coast here where I am, uh, these plank houses and the totem poles, like those totem poles weigh tons of pounds, they're huge. It's the equivalent of a megalith. And they start building burial mounds for important people. Society is starting to look a lot more familiar when we get into these complex hunting and gathering societies. And I think feasting is one of the ways that people build up these inequalities and political power. Um, because you can create debts that way and you can manipulate debts and manipulate people. And people that have surpluses do it the most. They have the big advantages.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Most of the societies that have the largest excess resources use those to stratify their society more hierarchically. Well,
That's right.
so yeah. So you just brought up something that I have to I want to dig into a little bit more. You said 10 or 20,000 years. Do you have some level? Because I know that one of the big sort of debates, so there's a big difference between someone like you who's a real archaeologist and people that are just interested in archaeology like me, like a regular person, and our understanding of being able to assess information. And it's my understanding that like the main, like a lot of times when people are talking about the early on civilization, they kind of pin about 10,000 BC as the start. Is there some indication, circumstantial or whatnot, that there's some older signs of civilization that are, date back 20,000 years ago, kind of in the middle of, like, deeper into the, I guess, I don't know, is that, so that's, I mean, I know we're in the Ice Age now, but is that considered like a different phase of the Ice Age or something like that far back?
Well, I should start off by saying it depends on where you are.
Okay.
Because on the Northwest coast here, we don't get this kind of complex culture developing until maybe 5 or 6 thousand years ago.
Okay.
In the Near East, it's the Natufian,
Hmm.
12,000 years ago, when all this stuff starts happening. When we first start getting
Hmm.
signs that they're feasting and that they're making beer and bread and everything else.
Hmm.
Um, and if you're in southwestern Europe, we start getting some of these signs, not for alcohol, but for feasting and more complexity. I think about 20 or 30,000 years ago.
No shit.
Um, yeah, I'm arguing
Hmm.
with some of the French
Hmm.
archaeologists now about this. They don't want to see any complexity or inequalities,
Hmm.
and I think the evidence is staring them in their face. You got record
Hmm.
keeping, you got wealth items, you have long distance exchange, people bringing in stuff, you got higher populations, you got major artwork happening. These are all characteristics of complex hunting and gathering societies, and I think that's where it started earliest.
And
But yeah,
these societies you're looking at are they in they're in France somewhere, like in?
yeah. Well, France, southern Germany, northern Italy, northern Spain, yeah, in that southwestern area.
So like the sites that you've looked at that you think may be 20 or 30,000 years old, how large do you believe those settlements may have been?
Well, uh, it's difficult to say because the excavations that have taken place usually only explore a small part of the archaeological deposits
Hmm.
there. And a lot of the larger settlements may have been down in the river bottom in the plain, which has got reworked from the glacier out melting and redepositions and things like that. But, I think, and when you get into the Russian plain in the northern Ukrainian
Hmm.
area, you're probably looking at settlements of several hundred people. In the southwest of France, maybe 100, 200 maximum, but that's still pretty substantial.
Okay, because I mean, I typically think of like a hunter-gatherer tribe of about 70 to 150 people. I don't know if that is that about
That's really high.
really
Yeah,
okay.
most of them are down around 30 to 50.
Okay.
Some of them sometimes get up a little higher, but the vast majority are 30 to 50.
Right. And part of that is just, what it was I mean, we're talking about something that, tribes that exist, like you said, 2 million years. So it's like, depending on the climate at the time and the availability of resources, the sizes of these tribes might have changed at different times. So
Yeah, oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, and the technology too.
hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, so then, if do you think that the something that, like, what do you think was more or less when they started settling down, you think that that was like what led to like festivals, and then what eventually led to excesses that could turn into beer or something like that?
Well, the settling down, becoming more sedentary, I think it's been the focus of a lot of people's attempts to explain what was happening. And it certainly has a role to play, especially in storage, storing food, because with these generalized hunters and gatherers, for the first 2 million years, they're not storing stuff. You know, they're moving around all the time. Um, they don't know when they're going to come back to a certain location, so it doesn't make any sense to store things. And storage has a lot of risks involved, and
Of course.
it takes a lot to develop the storage technology so it's effective, so that you know mold doesn't happen, insects don't get into it, animals don't get into it, it doesn't get stolen, you know, and on and on and on. Um, and so it really only happens much later in when we start getting these more complex societies.
Mm.
Storage, because it has these risks, people tend to overproduce because they know they're going to lose a certain percentage to, or they might lose a certain percentage to mold or insects or rodents or whatever it happens to be. So they tend to store a lot more than most years you need to in order to you know, try to offset these risks that might happen, but a lot of times don't. And so, what do you do when you're left with excess food that's been stored away? You know, you got a problem. It's either if you leave it, it's just going to rot and go bad eventually, or you can try to do something else with it. And so, I think the people start developing these strategies for using that food that's been stored in its excess at the end of the year. And one of the things you can do is give it away in feasts and try to use it to indebt people, to create debts, and to boost your own benefits. Or you can use it to pay for marriage partners and get more marriage partners, the more um, desirable marriage partners, or to create alliances with wealthy people that have you know, children that they want to marry. You can use food in a lot of different ways to create advantages. It's like investing. You know, investing in, you can use it to invest in animals, which are then used for as important gifts that indebt people. But it's like, you know, when you have extra money that from your salary or whatever it happens to be, what do you do with it? Well, you can go out and blow it, or you can try investing it for future uses. And if you use it for holding, I don't know, giving gifts to people that you want to develop strong relations with,
Mhm.
you know, girlfriends or whatever it happens to be,
Mhm.
that's one way of using it for social purposes. Or you can invest it in for the future, and that's what people do, I think, or did
Mhm.
when they ended up with excess food. They tried to find out ways to invest it in the future, and one of the ways of doing that is by having these reciprocal feasts where you give food and then you're owed food, especially important or desirable or very costly food like animals.
Well, so and one of the other things that makes me think of is like a festival. I mean, typically, I believe they're going to have a religious element to where it's like they're thanking, you know, whatever the local gods are, the harvest god, or however they have it broken down. And it seems that that because obviously people like feasts because they get to eat more and they get to hang out and they get to party. I mean, it's a you know, it's a good thing. It's fun.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
also if the harvest was terrible that year, you're gonna one, not be able to have it the excesses you need for a feast, so you're not gonna have your party. And then two, you might not even have enough to meet a lot of your basic needs anyway, depending on how bad the harvest was. And so it seems like there's a like not only is a lot of these festivals tied to, you know, you know, they end up deciding to associate that with, you know, the gods paying them favors, but also because if they, now they start being worried that like, well, the God gave, God's gave us graces, and now they're gonna, now we must have done something to make them mad, which is why our harvest was worse. And so that I can kind of see how that starts leading into different forms of religion or a priestly class or something like that.
Well, you've opened up a big can of worms
I
here,
know, I know. That's interesting. I mean,
so,
that's yeah.
so to speak. Not suggesting we should the worms were part of the feast, but
Mhm,
um, but a couple of things, and I've just forgotten some of the ones I wanted to
mhm,
go off on a tangent on. But yes, absolutely. A lot of times people try to validate a lot of the a lot of the new ideas that they're proposing, like paying money or paying food in order to get married, by invoking supernatural sanctions or supernatural approvals. It's not usually in terms of gods, but typically what we find in most of these tribal kinds of societies is that ancestors become very important. And
mm.
so you use these feasts in order to, a lot of times in honor of your ancestors. And, um, and so these ancestors in turn are portrayed as sending heavenly benefits, making the crops grow, making your family wealthy. So the more it's the positive feedback kind of idea, where the more you honor your ancestors through feasts and offerings to the ancestors, the more benefits they give you in return. And so you can say that I am wealthy and I am successful and I am uh, capable of having slaves, if you like, or
Mhm.
holding higher political positions, being more important in the village, because I have honored my ancestors with feasts, and therefore they've sent me all these blessings, in quotes, or material benefits as a result. And so, that's why I'm successful. So it's a justification for these inequalities that are developing. It's not because I'm exploiting you. It's because I'm more I'm more devoted to my ancestors. I hold more rituals. I give them bigger and better feasts, and that's why I'm so successful. And that's why you're so poor, because you don't do that. And
You're poor because you suck.
yeah,
Okay.
you're not religious enough. Yes, in terms of the ancestors.
Well, it sounds like history was rough. Okay. To I mean, no, yeah, man, we're going all over the place. I would like to talk a little bit more about because we talked about the feasts and different stuff like that. But what do we know about like the origins of beer? Like what seemed to be the what seemed to bring that up of all things?
Well, as I said, ethnographically, beer is one of the
Mhm,
three triumvirates,
mhm,
three elements of the triumvirate of feasts.
mhm,
Meat, starches, and beer or alcohol.
mhm,
Um, and so I was noticing that as a recurring pattern. And one of the things about feasts is that if you want them to be successful, and you want to indebt people, you have to attract people to your event. And how do you do that? Well, you do that because if nobody shows up, if you have a feast and nobody shows up, well, you're not going to be able to indebt anybody, and you're not going to be able to use your excess food for getting any benefits. So you
Wait,
got to attract people.
so you're saying the foundations of civilization was throwing good parties?
Basically, yes.
Yes, yes. All right, then whenever I'm out and I'm partying, I'm not being frivolous. I'm participating in an ancient ritual that's part of the foundation of civilization.
Well, today things are different,
They're a little different.
I mean, we don't have these reciprocal obligations for attending parties, and so. But this is a key feature in
Mm.
and traditional feasts. Um, as one New Guinea feast holder said in a film called Anka's Big Mocha,
Hmm.
because mochas are the feasts, he said, and he was giving away huge amounts to some of his guests at these feasts. And so the narrator said, what are you going to do if because he just gave away hundreds of pigs and lots of money and all sorts of other valuable things. And the interviewer said, "What are you going to do if this guy Parawa doesn't return your feast?" And Anka says, "I'll take him out behind my hut and slit his throat." So that doesn't happen at our parties too often these
I'm
days.
kind of glad. Sometimes you get drunk and forget to
Yeah,
get somebody the next round.
that's
I mean,
right.
I don't want to.
That's right.
I don't want to get my
That's right.
throat slit.
That's right. So, I mean, these things have major consequences. As one of my students who did a lot of the research said, these feasts are like Parliament. They're like Congress. People get in there, and it's politics, politics, politics. They're all negotiating, creating debts, favors, and lobbying, and any rate, that's what it's more like. And so, you're trying to attract people to get involved in this network. And once you get involved, the debts pile up and you never get out.
So it sounds like the
Uh,
mob.
well, in some respects it is. And an interesting sidelight here, off on another tangent, is I think that's why record keeping starts, why we start getting the first notations and the first counting systems. Because with generalized hunters and gatherers, they don't have counting systems that go above 10 or maybe 20 maximum. And that's it. Beyond that, everything is just, there was a lot. But when
Mm.
you get into these complex hunting and gathering societies and agricultural societies, the counting systems go into the hundreds and thousands and sometimes millions. Um, I think it's all related to keeping track of these debts because some of the debts involve hundreds of items or thousands of items,
Mm.
whether it's the number of fish or pieces of dried meat or blankets or whatever is being given away at the time, beads. At any rate, there's a lot of things that get given away to increase the debts involved. So beer, to come back to the original question, is why beer? Well,
Mhm.
beer is one of the things that people attract people most. They get happy, they get into altered states, and for whatever reason, it was, is, and always will be a major attractant for people. They spend more money on alcohol than anything else except pornography probably these days. Uh, yeah, and so that's why beer got started, I think, and I think people have always, well, maybe not always, but it's certainly in the Near East. It doesn't take, it's not rocket science to produce alcohol. Um, I was working in Tunisia for a while, and people used to tap the palm trees there, and they'd sell the juice from or the palm sap. It was like I don't know which is it. It was like ginger ale, I guess, something like that, in consistency, and it had a lot of sugar in it. And the thing about the palm sap there, it's easy to tap off the palm trees, but if you tap it in the morning, by the afternoon, it's starting to ferment. And so it's got little bubbles in it, just like ginger ale.
Mm.
But you're not supposed to drink alcohol in Arabic countries or in Islamic countries. So alcohol is prohibited, but by the afternoon, this palm sap is getting pretty tasty in terms. I mean, it's producing alcohol, So maybe what I'm trying to say is, anytime you've got any fruit juice, whether you've got excess grapes, what do you do with when the grapes get ripe? You got pounds and pounds and pounds of these ripe grapes. You can't just keep on eating them, but you can turn them into juice. But if you do that, it's going to start fermenting, and naturally. So I'm sure people were doing that. The palm sap, the grape juice, the other fruit juices, and I'm sure people have known about it for a long time, but those are only available for a short period of the year. If you want to drink all year round, you have to you have to have some grain, some starches that you can keep and start
Mm.
fermenting later on in the year. And so people are probably enjoying the fruit juices, the fermented fruit juices for tens of thousands of years, but they only really started brewing when they wanted to create alcohol on an all year basis and use it, I think, for feasting to attract people.
Okay, cool. That was something I never, because I was actually wondering about that. I'm like, you look at like what were some of the first alcohols, and it does seem like beer was the first deliberate alcohol. But that I was like, well, why that? It's like there's other plants out there you could ferment, but it's like,
Yeah,
oh, it's the shelf life of the grain itself that allows
yeah,
you to do that.
that's right.
So, so I we talked about this a little bit before, but the to what extent do you think that beer or food or what was the catalyst to go from these like small sort of settlements that held festivals and had these debts? What do you think was there a tie-in with food or with beer that pivoted them into these like larger, complicated, like like cities, like we think of like Uruk or one of these other really big civilizations that we hear about?
Yeah. Well, certainly when people started domesticating plants
Hmm.
and domesticating animals, I mean, there's always been a cap. If you've only got wild food, uh, you can only harvest and use as much food as the wild conditions produce.
Hmm.
Okay, cultivating, you're opening up more land and making it more productive. So when you start cultivating, um, you can increase the amount of food that is available by just cultivating more land. And and if you're also domesticating plants and animals, you can increase the productivity of the plants and animals by changing their characteristic, the size of the seeds, the ability of them to stay on the stalk so that you can harvest them all at once, and various other characteristics that you might want to use. So once this happens, the amount of surpluses that can be produced um, basically becomes limitless. It all depends
Mm.
on how much land you can clear and work, and how much you can increase the productivity by manuring, by irrigating, by putting in a whole lot more effort into what's going on. So, and that's been continuing on, into industrial farming that we have today. The cost of food compared to the past is way, way down. Um, and it's because of mechanization technology, basically. That's been going on for thousands of years, that process. And the more food you can produce, the more surpluses you can produce, the more people you can support, the larger communities you can support, the more specialists you can support from the surpluses. It's another positive feedback system that we are in now and going through, and eventually it's got to hit some sort of a limit. It's got to hit some sort of a ceiling, which a lot of people think isn't too far away.
Oh
But
yeah, well, I mean, it's like we've been working towards that ceiling for the last 10,000 years. We're
that's
still
it.
we think we're getting close to it. We'll
Yeah,
see.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, I don't.
So basically, that opens up the possibility of bigger cities, civilizations, more
Mm,
specialization, and all of the developments that we've seen in the last 5,000 years.
So I don't know if we covered this, and so I apologize if you already addressed this, but the big the big question: what do you think came first? Because we talked about the use of beer. What do you think came first, though, beer or bread?
Well, all the indications that I've seen indicate that they probably both developed about the same time.
Mm,
And so I, uh, my best guess is that they were both components of these feasts. They were
mm,
both essential elements, and they developed in tandem together. I don't see any priority of one over the other. Bread um, is, again, well, both beer and bread are costly.
mm.
They involve the use of surpluses, and to produce the surpluses is costly, but and then the processing is fairly involved as well, especially for bread, because you need to grind it into a fine powder, and that's not easy. I did a study on this, and people, whether you're grinding maize or corn or millet or wheat or whatever grain you want, you know, people are, if they're producing it for a daily food, as later happens, they're spending 3 to 5 hours a day grinding this stuff, women.
Mm.
And to me, there's no caloric advantage to spending that much time to get a little bit of caloric advantage from a finer grind of wheat. You get exactly the same material if you just boil it up like rice and eat it that way. I like eating wheat berries, whole wheat grains that are just boiled up. I think it's great. Uh, so what's the advantage of grinding it up and making bread? Well, you get a bigger rush. That the starches are absorbed more quickly into your system, and in environments where you have very little sugar, and in fact very little starch, as most hunters and gatherers have, having this finely ground stuff in your system that gets absorbed and turned into glucose very rapidly, it's like a sugar rush. Um, and it becomes very pleasurable.
It sounds like bread used to be like the ancient version of crack or something like that, where it was like they were
Yeah.
taking this stuff and they were turning into this thing, and it was like
Well,
bread was turning into
well,
like there was a war on bread.
well, both beer and bread are, yes. But anybody that's baked bread, fresh bread, especially French or Italian styles, the taste is just wonderful, and it really does give you a little bit of a rush, when
Right.
you
I mean,
have really good bread.
this is a nutrition podcast. So like you said, like I mean, bread gets absorbed faster. And so if you're having a lot of it, it can turn into excess, you know, carbs and body fat. And, it has, there's a whole thing about that, but I don't want to go too deep into that and start promoting people eating lots of bread. But if you're going to eat bread, fresh, right out of the oven bread is fucking amazing. It
Yes, that's
is.
absolutely right. And somebody was trying to tell me there's some sort of a chemical in freshly baked bread that affects your hormones or something, and gives you this rush. I've never been able to track that down, but it's that kind of an effect anyway. To me, it's that kind of effect. One other point I wanted to make though is that a lot of these, what I would call prestige kinds of foods, like alcohol and bread and meat, um, like they've all become, and chocolate, I think they all started out as very high prestige, high cost kinds of food for
Mm.
hunters and gatherers. They're not easy to produce. You have to have surpluses. Surpluses are not easy to produce initially. Um, but with technological changes, they become easier and easier to produce. Like white flour used to be very, very costly. Only the elites had it in pre-revolutionary France and places like that. 17, 1600s. Poor people couldn't afford that. Today, white flour is no
It's
is
everywhere.
nothing.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And the same thing goes with chocolate. Chocolate used to be basically money, used as money by Aztecs. So if you had a chocolate drink, it was like grinding up a $10 bill and putting it in water and drinking it down, you know. No, chocolate was really costly in the past. Only the elites had it. But today, it's cheapo, cheapo, you know, and same thing
Mm,
with beer. Beer used to be only for surpluses. Today, you know, a couple of bucks for a beer and, you know, you're off and away.
there you go. Well,
So,
so then,
so the
I mean,
point was that these prestige foods have become very common and very debased in a lot of situations
right.
today.
So we don't appreciate the history behind like this used to be a big deal.
That's
Um,
right.
yeah. So then, if bread is a specialty item, I think you alluded to it earlier, but like, was the thing that most people were eating was essentially just boiled grains?
Well, initially, I think that was probably the case. I mean,
Mm,
we get, you know, some, they might have been smashed, they might have been made into groats, you know,
mm,
like oatmeal or, you know,
mm,
oat flakes
mm.
uh, that you use for porridge. I would suspect there was something like that. They would have been soaked and then maybe mashed up a bit and then thrown in a pot to boil because it boil faster and it's easier to you know, absorb.
Mm.
But that's not really effort. Um, it's not really a big effort investment. So, but yeah, that's what makes most sense to me. And it
Mm.
was probably happening for, you know, thousands of years, way before we first get the first bread or the first domestication.
Oh, okay. So somebody at some point, some ancient baker, decided like, what if we smash the stuff up even more and add some water and some, you know. So
Yeah.
so then well, if that was the case, I mean, was that also, I mean, it sounds like that was the origins of soup as well, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Mm,
Well, I mean, soups. Opening up another can of worms here, but that we're not going to put in the soup, I hope.
mhm,
But at any rate, uh, soups have a very special role, I think, and the grains might become part of it. But even
mhm.
before that, um, you have to. This is a long tangent, but
Go for it.
okay. Figure we could do a whole program on just soups,
Yeah.
but you have to realize that in northern climates, um, the key thing is keeping warm during the winter,
Mm,
and you can't keep a fire going all the time when you're camping and moving around. It's just way too much effort and problems. So what hunters and gatherers generally tend to do is rely on body heat to stay warm and clothing. And in order to generate enough body heat to get through the winter, even if you do have some shelter or a fire occasionally, you need fats. Fats or starches. You need to build up your stores of body fat and have enough calories to burn um, to get through the winter and not freeze to death. And unfortunately, most game animals are fairly low in fats.
mhm.
The meat that we get at the market today, that another prestige item that's cheap these days, is generally 25-30% fat. You know, so they're bred to produce fat, which tastes best to us because it used to keep us warm in the wintertime, and people that had a good taste wanted more meat and more fat survived better through the winters. So we've developed this taste for fats and lipids and rich foods. Um, but they're hard to get in traditional hunting and gathering societies. And so people try to get as much out of the animals as possible. And one of the ways of getting that is in the bones, because bones have marrow. Marrow is essentially fat. They have these long sections of marrow in the middle of the bone, and then at the end of the bones is what's called cancellous, kind of spongy, kind of bony tissue, and that's where all the fats are produced for the body. So people go for the marrow. They split up the bones to get marrow, but getting the grease and the fats out of the cancellous spongy bone at the ends is very difficult unless you break it up into small pieces and can boil it. Unfortunately, hunters and gatherers didn't have any pots.
Right.
And so you have to make some sort of a container to boil things in, whether it's a wooden bowl or a bark bowl, or which has to be sealed up, or another kind of container. That's a lot of work. And then you can put the bones in this container, a bark bucket or whatever, put some water in, then you have to heat it up. And how do you do that? Well, basically, you build a fire and you get some stones that are not going to break up, and you heat up the stones till they're red hot in the fire, and then you transfer them with some tongs into the container with the water and the bones. And what that does is it boils the water, releases all the lipids that come to the surface, and you get a soup. And basically, this is a very involved kind of process. Takes time and energy, and it's special equipment and things like that. So soups become fairly important. They become, I think, prestige kinds of foods as well. And they're very highly relished. They've got high prestige, high value. If you have a greasy, rich soup when you're in the middle of the winter as a hunter and gatherer, it's the best tasting thing in the world. And you can throw other things in it as well, like any roots that you might dig up, or some grains that you might have, wheat grains or other kinds of grains, and mash up in your mortar or things like that. So you can add things to it. But the main ingredient is the grease, the lipids, the fats. And that's what keeps you warm. And that has come down through the ages, right into Shang dynasties in China. 1000 BC, they're writing about the delicious soups that they're bringing for the ancestors, for their feasts, for the ancestors. So soups are incredibly important for these traditional cultures, right up into almost modern times.
Well, I mean, I live here in South Korea, so I've gotten around some Korean cuisine and dug into their history a lot, and it's still a very heavy soup-based culture. I mean, a lot of
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
every time you go out to eat, they're gonna bring out a soup. It's like I think Koreans eat at least one serving of soup of some kind, at least one every single day.
Yeah.
It's very, very heavily into the soup. So
Well,
that
it's like
was
like I was saying, there's almost the same role as bread has in Greece.
mm,
You could have maybe you could have, but bread has become an everyday fare because it's technologically possible to do that, and soups too, and meat too, and beer too. Um, but I think it's the same value, the same this put on these important foods for feasting still is retained, so that you can have a big feast without maybe meat in Korea, but you can't have one without soup.
yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, so you're right. That was a bag of worms, or yeah, that was a can of worms. I was like, I didn't expect it. I didn't expect that. That was pretty. Well, it's steering back into the beer topic. You talked about a little bit about the debate that you've been having with some of the French archaeologists and different stuff like that. I know that. So like, are there any things that have like recent discoveries or anything that's happened in the last few years that have put a little more detail or changed what our perspective is on the some of the developments we've had as far as beer and civilization.
Well, in terms of these developments, yeah, I think there have been like this same argument that I've been having about complex uh, hunting and gathering societies in Europe. I've also been having with a lot of the Near Eastern archaeologists in dealing with the Natufian, who
Okay.
think the Natufians were all egalitarian and which and without any social or economic inequalities and things like that. And I think it's just very short-sighted.
Mhm.
Everything I see in the Natufian says to me, no, these are complex hunting and gathering peoples with feasting and a lot of the technology can be understood as producing beer, like the grinding technology, because you need to grind up a grain in order to produce beer as well.
Mm.
And a lot of these big basins that they have, some of them are big as carboys, they contain 25, 50 liters.
Mm.
So what are you doing with that much? Either you're storing food or making beer. In 2012, I and some of my students did a study on this, and we said, okay, well, we don't have any smoking beer pot here, but a lot of the circumstantial indicators show that we've got complex hunters and gatherers that were having feasts, and that they were grinding grain. And if they were grinding grain and making bread, a good chance is that they were also producing beer for their feasting as well. And so we produced a prediction that we would find evidence for brewing back in the Natufian. The
Mm.
title of our article was "What Was Brewing in the Natufian?"
Mm.
And so, and more recently, 2020, there's been some people that have been looking at residues in grinding stones. And this is Li Liu from China. And she found from looking at these residues and the starch grains that were in these grinding stones that they were brewing. The
Nice.
starch, the starch grains, get attacked by enzymes during the conversion of starches into sugars for brewing. And as a result, the starch grains get deformed and they get eaten away in a characteristic fashion. And she found that was what the starch grains were like in these mortars and pestles. So as far as I'm concerned, yeah, our prediction was right. You don't find many predictions like that in archaeology, but so I was very happy to see that. And also at the site of Göbekli Tepe, which is, sort of right at the very end of the um, Mesolithic or the Epipaleolithic, just before we get indications of domestication. This is before, there's no domesticated plants or animals at the site, so people were saying they're hunting and gathering. Well, they were creating these large vats and containers that certainly look like they're brewing. And some of the last publications by Dietrich and company
Mm.
indicate that they think that they were being used for brewing as well.
Mm. So, and that's I because I've heard that a lot, is that because of the lack of sort of surrounding evidence that they think that it was hunter gatherers creating that stuff. And I'm obviously not an expert on the subject, but it's like I have such a hard time wrapping my mind around hunter gatherers coming together in large enough groups or over time or whatever it took for them to put up these monoliths, or even to think that that was worth their energy and time to do that. And so I mean, it makes me happy to hear that it sounds like it's a little bit of an open debate in terms of how sophisticated they were, right?
Well, that's what people argue about, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I would point out, yeah, it's a stretch for a lot of archaeologists to consider that Göbekli Tepe could have been created by hunting and gathering societies. But on the northwest coast here, where I am,
Mm-hmm.
as I mentioned before, people were putting up totem poles that weighed tons. They're wood, but they're still really heavy,
Mm-hmm.
and huge house posts and huge house planks that weigh tons as well. So the people are moving around stuff, and they're creating mounds, burial mounds on the same scale as a lot of horticultural or agricultural societies. So yeah, it's something we don't expect, but there it is, both
Just
ethnographically and archaeologically.
okay, so it's a little bit like an Amish barn raising where they get together, the whole Ishmael and Ezekiel, and everybody gets together at the same time to do all this heavy lifting kind of stuff.
Well, I don't think it's quite like that. I think it's more like an Indonesian tombstone transport operation, where basically in order to transport some of these big stones that are used for burial chambers. And they are megaliths, as big as the
Mm.
stones in Stonehenge. Um, the way you get people to do that, to cooperate, is not as a communal effort. I mean, but they are people from the community,
Mm.
obviously. But you pay them. You pay them
Mm.
with feasts, and we call these work feasts. So, and as a matter of fact, it takes about the slaughter of one buffalo, one water buffalo, every day to get people to drag these huge stones across the landscape to put up these funeral monuments.
So something just occurred to me. It sounds kind of like we're talking about these feasts and we're talking about how it indebted folks, but that they're more or less used as kind of a currency. And it sounds like there may be a way in which using these feasts is, like you just said, used as the payment, but that there is sort of a parallel between the rise of putting up large megalithic monuments or any kind of like large construction project and throwing these feasts, because it becomes a way of using the excess. It's like, I'm going to pay you with this feast, but in turn you owe me some labor to make this extra, to make this thing.
That's right. That's
Oh,
exactly right. And if you can throw some beer into it, people will come in droves.
so
Beer and
that's,
meat,
oh, okay,
beer,
wow.
meat, and starches.
Man, that you just blew my mind. I actually don't have any follow-up questions for that. That's crazy. That's pretty awesome. So, I mean, I don't know how much more work is being done on that, but it's almost like you can start looking at, other civilizations and seeing these large megalithic structures or other places where clearly it required a lot of work and a lot of organization and other stuff like that. And then you can kind of link that into sort of the reciprocity. Because one of the questions, especially to lay people like me, that we look at when we see these big things is like, why did you do that? Like there's always the explanation of, oh, it was to honor the gods or something like that. But it was like, but you decided to do it that way. I was like, there's clearly something going on behind that.
Well, in Indonesia,
Mm.
in Indonesia, they do it in order to make their ancestors more powerful. Remember
Mm.
the ancestors? This
Right, right.
positive feedback loop. Yeah, the more
Mhm.
powerful you can make your ancestors, the more claim you have to owning the most productive property and to owning slaves and to being successful and powerful and everything else. And it's something that everybody can see. Well, my ancestor is more powerful than yours because I've got a bigger megalith here.
That's right. That'll show them. So, just to bring things around, like, are there any projects or anything that you're working on at the time, right now, that you're particularly interested or you want to discuss?
Uh, Not anything that directly ties into this, but the thing I'm really interested at present is a development here in North America back in the past, something I've been working on in British Columbia. These little tiny seeds. I don't know if you know what lamb's quarters is, or goosefoot, or quinopods. A lot of people think they're just weeds, but they're basically like quinoa. Quinoa is a quinopod, and that's where the word comes from, quinoa. But the wild form of quinoa is belongs to the quinopod family, and they're all very similar. And they were used for a long time, but they've got this toxic substance in the skins, in the shells that are called saponins. But they were used all over the place, from eastern North America, where they were domesticated, to the west coast. They were used in the southwest. They were used in Mexico, where they became chia, one form of chia, and some other kinds of quinopods that were used. And down into South America, where they were used as quinoa, and some other varieties as well. So huge, wide use. Um, in North America, they became widely used, the seeds were used and domesticated, and then people stopped using them about 1,000 years ago. And we don't know exactly why they stopped using them. They could have been replaced by maize, It just took the place of the quinoa. But I think my idea is that these things, it was hard to get the toxic substances removed from these seeds. It took a lot of effort and time and work, and the seeds are very small, and so you need a lot of them, and they need to be boiled up for a long time. So my idea is that maybe these were being used as feasting foods as well, high cost, prestigious kinds of foods because they had starches in them,
Mm.
which were important and rare in the environment or hard to get in hunting and gathering environments. And I'm trying to develop the role in feasting as another major feasting food in native uh, major feasting food before maize came into the scene.
Okay. No, I mean, that definitely ties into what we're talking about. No, that's actually that's pretty interesting. All right. Hey,
Well, it might be a kind of crop for the future as well, because it can grow in a lot of environments where you don't need as much water as maize, and so it could be that we won't be able to grow any more maize or as much maize in North America as we used to, but we might be able to replace maize with quinoa or other kinds of quinoa pods as a staple.
all right. All right. No, that's excellent. No, this was actually really interesting. I reached out to you because I wanted to talk about the origins of beer, which we did talk about, but then we talked about all this other stuff that like tied it together. And is it like, this other, as far as the bread and the feast and all the other stuff, man, this is really actually very eye-opening. So,
Well, it kept me going for years and years and years and years. Every time I turned around, there was something else interesting. Yeah.
okay. No, but anyway, I just wanted to thank you for coming on the podcast. I thought I had a lot of fun with this.
Same.
All right, cool.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for watching the podcast so far. These are a lot of fun to make. The main mission I have behind making this podcast is that I want to make sure that you have the information and the tools that you need to maintain an active and healthy and injury-free lifestyle for as long as possible. We're going to keep on making these. If you think that you know anybody that will also get a lot of benefit from the information in this interview, please do them a huge favor and share this video with them. Thank you.